Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sesotris, and this week I wanted to do a surprise anthology of my favorite poets, adding on to last week's video, because there was a number that as soon as I was finished the video, I was like, oh, I should have mentioned that person. So we're going to do more poetry today, and it's just going to be a lot of fun. So let's get into it. Before I start, I did want to mention finding poetry can sometimes be difficult if you don't want to necessarily buy each individual book. And so if you're looking to get into poetry but don't want to break the bank, check out poets.org to start with. There's tons of poetry, background information for poets, information on different genres, and it's all free, and you can just read poems to your heart's content to find things that you like. There's tons of poets up there. It's a great resource. And so if you're interested in poetry but don't necessarily want to go out and just spend a bunch of money, poets.org is a great starting place, because you can read a ton of the poems I've talked about here for free and just immerse yourself in it with very little cost, or at no cost at all. So it's a great starting place. Also, if you're looking to purchase poems but don't necessarily want to buy a bunch of individual poetry books for each artist kind of thing, go to used bookstores or library sales, especially if it's a college town, because you can often find people's old poetry or literature anthologies, and those will contain a ton of amazing poets. Even if it's just the Norton Anthology of American Literature, there's going to be tons of poems in that. So find used anthologies from students who didn't want them anymore, because it's cheap and you'll be able to get a ton of poetry for very inexpensive. So, all right, moving on. Last week I said I didn't want to talk about necessarily epic poetry, because that's very much kind of its own thing, and I will do a thing on that later. But I did want to start today with a sort of mini epic poem, and that is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Also, in college I had one professor. She was Australian, and she pronounced it Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And she was very, very smart. So I've always wondered, is that the correct pronunciation? Is that maybe the English pronunciation? Help me out here. Is it Sir Gawain and the Green Knight or Sir Gawain? So I'm kind of curious. Anyways, this is a very weird epic poem. It's a part of the King Arthur expanded universe and features sort of a strange green-skinned knight who bursts into sort of Camelot, the Round Table, and issues a challenge to the Knights of the Round Table, and Sir Gawain takes it upon him to respond to this challenge. It's a really mind-bendy, complicated thing, and it's a ton of fun. It's weird. It's technically a Christmas story. Do with that what you will, but it's fun. It's small. Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien did a translation of this, and I'm still looking for it. So, but this is definitely a great one if you're interested in epic poetry but don't want to commit to something huge and massive. This is a good one to start with. So starting out, and you have to apologize, I'm recovering from a mild cold, so I sound a little weird, but just ignore that and I'll be fine. I wanted to start out talking about a poet who is very controversial. This isn't going to be in any kind of chronological order, so I'm starting in the 1950s, 1970s, with the poet Anne Sexton and her book Transformations. This is a book of poetry that I have always really loved, but I learned a few years ago the author was not a great person. She suffered from untreated, bipolar disorder, I think. It was untreated. Mental health in the 50s and 60s was non-existent. And she was very, very abusive in sometimes horrifying ways to her children. And, nothing's been confirmed for sure, but, we're going to believe victims here. So the question is should we still read works by authors who were terrible people. And I know this is part of a much bigger discussion about, what do we do? I posed this question to Threads, and I got some really great nuanced responses. And it seems like kind of the most reasonable approach is, we're not going to ban books, we're not going to censor anyone, but people need to be kind of aware of what they're getting into so that they can make informed decisions. So, I wanted to kind of let everyone know what kind of person Anne Sexton was. It does make it difficult to sort of engage with her work. I've had this since I was a teenager, and I really liked it, but, I have kind of a complicated relationship with it. So, going forward, I'll say, it is your choice if you want to read this for sure, but just be aware of what kind of person she was and make your own decision about whether or not you want to engage with that. So this book is based on Grimm's fairy tales. There's a number of the tales themselves that are told sort of in poetry form, and then after each story is sort of a poem that either breaks it down, explores the themes of it, deconstructs the story in some way, casts it in a modern light. It's really, really interesting. And so each poem sort of takes the Grimm's fairy tale and either focuses on one aspect of it and digs into that, or kind of pulls the story apart to kind of get at sort of its flaws or the message that it's telling or something. The poetry digs into kind of really the deep, dark places of human identity and the bad things that people can do. A lot of Grimm's fairy tales were quite violent and gruesome, and this really kind of digs into that. And so this book, Transformations, is really, really interesting. I did not know anything about the author when I first got it, and I read it, and I just really enjoyed it. It was sort of one of the earliest sort of books of poetry that really grabbed me. And of course, finding out that the author was not a wonderful person, it does kind of taint the reading experience a little bit. And so I don't really know if I want to keep this or what. I don't know. I'm still a little conflicted about that. But I do think it's really interesting. Anne Sexton was a confessional poet, and she talked about a lot of things that people didn't want women to talk about. Really hard-hitting subjects, things like abortion, and stuff like that. And she was a very influential feminist poet. And so even though she was an awful person, I think her work deserves to still be studied in an academic setting because it was very important and she was a really accomplished poet. In terms of reading her stuff for fun, that's kind of up to the reader to decide if they want to do that. But this is a poem, like a book of poetry that it meant a lot to me, and so I have a hard time letting go of it. But this has happened with other authors, and so it's just something that you have to kind of deal with. But she's no longer with us, and the money isn't going toward, if you buy her books, it's not going towards any causes that are harmful or anything. But someone online also said that we really should honor her victims by not presenting her as something that she's not. So be very aware. Anne Sexton was an awful person and was very cruel to her family, but this particular book of poetry was really important to me when I was in college. So do with that what you will. So we'll move on from there. So jumping back in time, I wanted to go back to my favorite era of poetry, and that is the Romantic era, and we're going to talk about John Keats. I didn't include Keats in the previous video because I've really only read his greatest hits, and so I didn't really feel like I knew enough about his work to really kind of dig into it, but I still want to talk about him. John Keats is great. And he also provided sort of the inspiration for my favorite sci-fi series of all time ever, the Hyperion Cantos. There's an android in that who is like an android of John Keats. It's so great. But Keats is a romantic poet. His lyric poetry is beautiful. You've probably even heard of some of it, Ode to a Grecian Urn, Ode to a Nightingale. that kind of stuff. And it's just very evocative and visually gorgeous. He also wrote narrative poetry, like longer storytelling poetry. And it's interesting to kind of look at that because he wasn't very good at it when he first started. There's two poems. There's Endymion and then there's Hyperion. Endymion was written pretty early on in his career, and it was eviscerated by critics. They thought that it was bland. They thought that it was just poorly made, and even Keats himself said that it wasn't very it wasn't the kind of poem that really showed a lot of skill. And then you've got his poem Hyperion, which was very late in his career, and it's unfinished. He got, I think, 3 books into it, and then kind of it fizzled out. He was taking care of his dying brother at the time, and he couldn't focus on it. He tried to sort of restart it again, and he wrote a poem called The Fall of Hyperion, which was sort of meant to recast it as sort of a personal struggle, but that, again, wasn't finished. But comparing the 2 poems is really, really interesting because you can see kind of how his art changed and evolved over time. But Keats is great. His lyric poetry is incredible. Please read his stuff. I do want to read more of his lyrical poetry because it really is just something to kind of sink into. Again, you've got that, you know, nature and humankind and struggling with concepts of self and concepts of sort of the flaws of humanity, and it's just great. So definitely would recommend some Keats. So next up is a poet that I completely forgot in my last video, and I don't know why, because he's one of my favorites, and that is William Butler Yeats. This is a modernist poet. He kind of straddled the line between romantic poets and modernist poets, because a lot of his stuff is very pastoral. He was very much into sort of Irish folklore and the kind of Irish landscape, and just wonderful. A lot of his later poems got a lot weirder once he got really deep into the modernist stuff. You've probably heard his poem, The Second Coming. It's quoted everywhere. That's where you get the phrase, you know, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. You've got this image of like a sphinx slouching towards Bethlehem, and very much like apocalyptic sort of imagery and biblical imagery and stuff. That one is quoted all over the place. You know, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. You've heard this poem. I know it because it's quoted everywhere. But there's another poem of his called The Wild Swans at Coole. Coole. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Yes, The Wild Swans at Coole. And that poem is just beautiful. We read that one in class, and it's sort of this image of sort of loss and emptiness and loneliness and, you know, the regular rhythms of nature sort of falling apart over time. And it's a poem that, like, everyone kind of read it, and we got to the end and it just sort of hit everyone, and we just sort of sat in like stunned silence for like a full minute before anyone started talking. And that's one that I love to revisit. But he is such a beautiful, I don't know, he's just very good at painting pictures, and his stuff is very Irish. He's an Irish poet, and his stuff is very suffused with sort of the language, the culture, the folklore of Ireland. And so there's so much of kind of fantasy blending with reality, the truths that we can find in folktales, how they inform the real world. There's this sort of disconnect between kind of the urban landscape and the forest, and he tries to kind of reconcile that through his work. But he's just really incredible. A lot of his poems, you really need to kind of know a lot about sort of Irish folklore and Irish mythology to sort of get fully. So there's a lot of things where I'll read it and I'll be like, I think I'm missing some context here. But he's an incredible poet, and his stuff is just incredible. And I'm just repeating myself now. But William Butler Yeats, please read his work because he's wonderful. One of my favorites. All right, so now we're going to leap forward into sort of the postmodern era, and another poet that I wanted to talk about was Denise Levertov. And she is an American poet. She had a really complicated kind of family history. She lived in England at one point, moved to the US. Her work is really, I don't know, it's expressive and it's powerful. She's a feminist writer, and she writes kind of a lot of different types of styles, but my favorite thing is when she writes really short, kind of delicate lines. One of my favorite poems of hers is The Wings, and as you can see, it's very thin and kind of a frail looking poem. And it's funny because it's all about sort of finding this inner strength, turning your darkness into something strong, and, you know, finding your power basically, when, you know, all you have is sort of one wing left, sort of thing. But the poem itself is very delicate and kind of unstable looking. It looks like it could kind of topple over or break at any minute, and so it's such a gorgeous depiction of sort of the tenuousness of sort of wanting to be strong in a vulnerable moment when things are kind of crashing around you. You want to be strong and powerful, and you're like, I can do this, but you're like seconds away from just giving into despair. And you know, I love this one. You know, the last lines of the poem are, you know, could I go on one wing, the white one, you know, kind of thing. She's got one wing left, and you know, is it possible to sort of stay strong when everything's terrible? But Denise Levertov is great. Not all of her poems look like that. There's some other ones of hers. Here we go, and there's all my notes all over the place. But, you know, she's just very descriptive and really compelling, and I really like her work. Now, this is another poet that I completely forgot to mention in my last video, and that is Adrienne Rich. Adrienne Rich is, again, very visual, very descriptive. She's very abstract in the way that she kind of crafts her images. It's very, not nightmarish, but very kind of strange and jumbled and kaleidoscope, and, you know, she's just really good at that kind of thing. She's a queer feminist poet, and her work is strong and powerful and just grabs you by the shirt collar and pulls you over. One of my favorite poems of hers is called The Planetarium, and it begins with the lines, a woman in the shape of a monster in the shape of a woman, the skies are full of them. And, you know, just talking about, you know, constellations and mythology and the depiction of women in history and just all of that. And she's so wonderful. She's just kind of one of those people who you just have to sort of disconnect your brain and just sort of float through this sort of kaleidoscope of images with her in her work. And it's great. She's very gripping, and she's a ton of fun to read. Her work is great. Another poet, another postmodern poet that I wanted to mention is Audre Lorde. She's another one who's really interesting. She's her parents are West Indian. She grew up in New York, and she has this really incredible kind of description of herself in here. She said, I am, Audre Lorde wrote, Black, woman, and poet, all three are facts outside the realm of choice. But what is in my blood and kin of richness of brown earth and noon sun, and the strength to love them comes the roundabout way from Africa through sun islands to a stony coast, and these are the gifts through which I sing, through which I see. She's just a really powerful, descriptive writer again. One poem of hers that's really incredible is called Coal, and it's talking about sort of the value that's placed on words that are spoken by people who are not part of sort of the establishment, the white male kind of majority. And her work is just gripping and powerful, and it's so great. The last line of Cole says, I am black because I come from the earth's inside. Now take my word for jewel in the open light. She's just fantastic. Kind of like Adrienne Rich, very descriptive in an abstract way, but very grounded in sort of the reality of sort of the lived experience of a ton of people. And she really kind of got at that that disconnect between sort of the cultures that come to America and are sort of forced to sort of integrate into it, and are forced to sort of lose the things that made them, you know, who they are, and having to hold on to that. So yeah, Audre Lorde, wonderful. Read more of her work. She's great. And finally, for this video, I wanted to talk about this poem, or this book of poems. It's called Out of Sight by Eamon Grennan, and this is an arc that I got in grad school. Our poetry professor wanted us to write, or wanted me and a couple other people to write a review for it, or for various books, for our local university publication. And so I was really excited, and I went really overboard because I was terrified of like offending this real living poet who wanted me to review their work. And I still have this, you know, uncorrected proof, and I treasure it dearly. The review turned out really well, but it was, I obsessed over it so much that it became like one of the best things I wrote in grad school, and it wasn't even for a grade, but that's okay. But this is a collection of kind of new and old poems from the poet's sort of career, and they're just gorgeous. They're descriptive. There's lots of nature, especially insects. There's lots of kind of moments of like, you know, fireflies and dragonflies and spiders in the margins of kind of daily life and sort of the things that are going on inside our lives, as observed by kind of the creatures of nature. Just really descriptive, beautifully poetic. One of the reviews on the back of this describes it as the verbal equivalents of 17th century Dutch paintings. So just really lush and, you know, emotive and everything. But Eamon Grennan, I've not read any other of his works, but I loved this book so much, and I still have it, even though you know, it's been like a million years. But again, this is another one, if you're kind of new to poetry and you want to kind of get into it, start with something like this. This is really accessible. It's complex and it's gorgeous, but it's related to kind of the everyday, and you know, universal experiences of things that all people kind of go through. And so it's very relatable. And so I really, really, really love this one. So with that, that is kind of the end. Again, I'm sure there's other poets. I'm going to get to the end of this, and I'm going to turn this thing off, and I'm going to remember other poets that I forgot to mention. But we're going to leave it at that. This is my introduction to poetry. I'm hoping that this will kind of encourage others to either read more poetry or to read poetry for the first time. There's so much there, and there's so many different styles and genres and approaches that I'm sure there's something out there that will kind of reach out to you. So with that said, I will let you go. I will see you next week, and hopefully by then I won't be sick, and I will talk to you then. All right, bye-bye.